Derek, I am so excited to have you on the podcast. We go way back.
We
Like,
do. We do.
I don't know when we first met, but I want to say it was like
Middle school, at least. I mean,
cool. 2004, probably. Both of our stories like have intertwined at different points, and I know your brothers really super well, and then you're friends with my brother who
yeah.
so we just go way back. It's just so special to have you on the podcast.
And it's a long time coming. And I'd be lying if I didn't say I wasn't nervous to tell my story. But ever since I heard about your podcast, which was actually from Paul, your brother, so I started following your social media and I just think it's so cool what you're doing. But I've had multiple people at different times say like, hey, you got to go on Ashley's podcast. And I even talk to you. And it's just finally, it's like that when you're sitting in sacrament meeting and you feel like you got a bigger testimony, but you don't really want to do it. And you're like, this is God telling me I got to do this. So here we are.
Yep. I love it. Also, another connection we have is Trey, Derek's cousin Trey. I've actually kind of referenced Trey, not naming him, but he was a huge influence on me when I first started coming back to church. We worked together in California, and I was only like a year sober, and I used to watch Trey and Jed. Shout out to Trey and Jed, and I would watch how they would incorporate the spirit into everyday life. And
Mm.
I'll just never forget Trey listening to conference talks. Like we were doing summer sales together and we would always be in the car. Trey and I like fought like brother and sister. It was good times, but like I just remember him playing conference talks on the way out to our area and he would be reading his scriptures and I just saw how somebody interacts in the gospel and like how they apply it into their life. And it was so impactful for me in those early days of sobriety and coming back to the church. So shout out to Trey.
No, it's funny because it was probably the year after or the year before that I did summer sales with Trey. I had just been clean and sober a year or two. I don't remember the time, but he was recently off his mission. Same thing. We shared a room. So, we're in this little room in some apartment in Escondido. He would get up early and read his scriptures, and he was such just a strong influence for me. It'll come out in my story that there were times where I didn't have a driver's license for a period of time, and he was like my chaperone. And we joke about that to this day, but, I would foot the gas bill a lot, but he would similar thing. Like, right, listen to conference talks on the way out, on the way back, I'd listen to music at the end of the day, but he's awesome. So I'm glad you brought him up. Shout out Trey.
Well, awesome. Okay, well, let's get started. We can just start from the beginning.
Okay. To state the obvious, I grew up in St. George since we knew each other all the way back in middle school. Just like the Book of Mormon starts, my story starts with being born of goodly parents, right? Like it's the first verse and it's so true. And, I gotta not get emotional. Can't start off crying, Ashley. So I'll say I have four daughters. So I feel like I say that with every daughter, I've gotten more emotional. And so I have a lot of emotions. And when I feel the spirit, I cry. Everybody's touched different ways. It makes me cry. So there might be some tears. Well, I'll try to avoid it. My parents are awesome. They raised me, amazingly well. And I had your kind of typical Mormon upbringing, church, 3 hours, on Sunday. Just crazy to think 3 hours as a kid. I have four little kids and 2 hours can be a challenge. I always had, good experiences in church and in the gospel and, scouts and young men's and all of those things. And I feel like I had the makings of a testimony really young. I have fond memories of my baptism and when I received the Holy Ghost. I remember feeling the Spirit. I remember doing baptisms for the dead for the first time at the St. George Temple. And I don't know, I was 12 or 13. And I remember walking into the temple and just having the most overwhelming feeling. Like I was in the presence of the Lord, like just so much peace and such a comforting feeling. So I had those experiences. I wasn't fully converted. There's testimony and conversion are two very different things. Probably the best way I've learned to understand the difference is from a talk from Elder Bednar that I read, years ago. But he says having a testimony is knowing something's true. being converted is staying true to what you know. And I just think it's a simple way to break it down because you may know something's true, but not live it, you know? And I feel like that's kind of my story. I never felt the church wasn't true, but I went through a long period of not living the gospel, right? So when I was in middle school, I think it was eighth, ninth grade, I had friends that started smoking weed and I got exposed to that. And I knew it wasn't a good thing to do. I'd been taught that that was bad, but it just seemed kind of innocent and fun. And so I tried that and I liked the way, I liked it and got into this kind of phase of partying through middle school and high school. I tried alcohol and all those things that are kind of gateways into harder drugs. And I started to dabble with more harder drugs in high school. And what really was the kicker for me was opiates. I kind of lived in that early 2000s. I graduated high school 2007, so this was 2004, 5, 6. Painkillers were just becoming more and more abundant. There's that opioid epidemic, and I got exposed to those on the streets, and I had broken my knee when I was in middle school. It's a little background snowboarding. If you can't see the map, I like to snowboard and ski. My dad was a big skier, but I broke my knee snowboarding, and I remember I obviously had a prescription to painkillers and muscle relaxers, and I liked the way I felt when I took them. Right? They're literally called painkillers. They like kill pain. And some people don't like them, but I just loved the way I felt. So then I started abusing them in high school while I was partying, and it started just not a full blown addiction, but it developed into that, right? It got to the point where when I was graduated high school and 18, like I was an addict, couldn't function really without him. And at that time in my life, it was kind of like a lot of the good friends I had in high school, they moved on, went to BYU or went on missions or moved somewhere else to college. And I was just kind of left in a bad circle of influence and I needed a change. And so I kind of opened up to my parents and they had known some of my struggles, but not the full extent. So I moved up to Orem, went to UVU. I graduated high school, did a semester at Dixie College, Utah Tech. I'll have such a hard time ever calling it Utah Tech. It's Dixie to me, but
Yeah.
so I move up there. And as you know, I mean, you moved around, you had a similar challenge with drugs and it doesn't really matter where you live. If you don't fully want to change, you're not committed to removing that stuff from your life. So I fell into it, found that same stuff up there, got into a worse crowd. And actually what I learned in Utah County is it's very easy to get heroin. People go to Salt Lake and they get heroin. And I had done a lot of, opiates, painkillers, medicinal, pharmaceutical, but never heroin. And I tried that and I mean, that's just pure evil. It's so addictive, so powerful, it's cheaper, and it just became I just spiraled, right? And so there were a couple key things that happened to me though that made me really think I needed to change, and this whole time I knew what I was doing wasn't right. It's not like, oh, I hate the church. I just wanted to, like, I was just trapped and I didn't know how to get out of it. Right. And it's a challenge. I feel for those people that have these issues. I've been through it. And the hardest thing I've ever done in my life was overcoming my addictions. And, I couldn't have done it without the gospel. So I got arrested. I got a DUI one time when I was living in Utah County. So I went to jail and that was kind of one of my first wake up calls of like, what am I doing? Who knows what I had mixed other drugs and was drinking. And I wake up in a jail cell, didn't even know how I got there. And that was like the scariest thing. So when I got out of there, I was like, okay, I got to cut this stuff out. And I remember calling my mom. My mom's just so amazing. And, I always felt so loved. Anytime I needed help, like they were willing to help me. And I stayed up in Utah County, but it was like, okay, let's get you more professional help. And I went to a doctor and got prescribed Suboxone, a drug to help you get off opiates and did that, followed the advice of the doctor and like weaned myself off. So I kicked like that stuff. And that was a big step in the right direction, but I still had never gone back to church. I still like do little things like using tobacco or drink. And I just thought like, oh, I can do that and be fine. Right. I ended up getting in a pinch. Like I was struggling in school and financially, and I was getting kicked out. The place I was renting at the time, we were getting kicked out because the owners were like selling the home. And it's just amazing all these people in my life that kind of stepped in at a time where I really needed it. And this was, I had an uncle who came in and picked me up and was so optimistic and positive and told me how much potential I had in my life. And I stayed with my grandparents for a little bit. And then a good family friend, Riley Edwards, who you know, Ashley, shout out to Riley if he listens to this.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he's a podcast listener as well. So
Riley, he's a stud. He's a Canadian, just beast of a guy. And he had served his mission in St. George when I was young, and my dad was a ward mission leader. So I don't know, I met him when I was maybe 8, 9, 10 years old, and like he had, was serving in the Provo South mission. And when he was in St. George, he worked with my dad a lot as a ward mission leader. So he'd come over to our house, and I thought he was the coolest. Like he snowboarded, he was cool, he had a strong testimony, and he just stayed really close with our family. At the time, he had like gone to BYU and had done door to door sales. He'd sold alarms, and he was going out to sell pest control, and he was married. He reached out to me and said like, "Hey, come with me for the summer." Took me under his wing, let me move in with him to his house, and then drove out. We drove out together to Southern California, and we did a whole summer selling pest control. It was tough, but it like kicked my butt into gear. I stayed pretty straight laced when it comes to like partying. I drank a few times. I still was holding on to this crutch of like, yeah, I'm not using drugs, but like I can drink and it's fine. But every time I would drink, like I was the type that I couldn't just have a few drinks. Like I'd get really drunk and it was very, very unhealthy, right?
I have to say something really quick on the topic of Riley. So he actually, just to give listeners some context for who this guy is, he let me come live with him while I was still actively using and he wanted to help me. And he let me live with him. I was still such a mess, and his pregnant wife drove me to rehab in the middle of the night. And I totally squandered the whole everything they did. And then 2 years later or so, they let me come back after I had sobered up. And that's where I was selling pest control with Trey, after I had actually gotten sober. And he gave me another shot after I just totally, And so, anyway, very incredible family that just has done a ton for both of us.
No, he'll give you the shirt off his back. And Lisa's the same. They're just phenomenal
Yep.
people. So he was a big influence. So he was very strong in the gospel. But at the time, I may have gone to church every once in a while on Sunday, but Sunday was like your only day off. I feel like I had to go to the beach, and like I said, in fact, I felt so bad after the fact that the owner of the pest control company, I talked him into letting me borrow his ID. And I told him I was going with another rep who was like this returned missionary. And we were going to Huntington Beach. I think it was like the 4th of July, and we wanted to watch the fireworks. And I said, like, the group they'll be going to bars. I need your ID, but I will not drink. And I ended up getting like wasted drunk. And it was just another one of those experiences where I'm like, what am I doing? And I remember Riley got wind of it, and I remember waking up and it was like disappointing your dad. And he was just like, in a loving way, so stern, like, if you do this crap again, you idiot, wake up. What are you doing? But he has this way of doing it that, he loves you. And so that had happened. And, I got home. I came back and I was in Utah County. And I was kind of trying to figure out where I go next in my life. And I ended up going to a party, drinking, and was left the party, was driving, and one of my headlights was out, and I get pulled over. They see my history, so they, have me step out of the car, go through the whole ordeal, and I get another DUI. And it was a Halloween party, 2009. I'll never forget. It's the last time I drank alcohol. So this time now I'm sitting in jail for a few more days. My family's not going to bail me out. I have a, friend that ends up getting me out of jail, and I was staying with him, and I was so afraid to call my family and so disappointed in myself, and knew I had let so many people down. And, when I sat in jail, I was like, what am I doing with this? This is the second time now I've been in jail. And I'm like, you sit in intake and you're around like people that are coming off meth, and like you're just in a holding cell with 10 people. And it's like, I started really reflecting, and it's like, okay, is this the life I want to live? The path I'm on, it's going to lead to jail or death, or, it's not happiness. And I started thinking about all the people I admired, that I wanted to be like, that I looked up to, that I respected. the Riley Edwards, my parents, some friends that had gone on missions, and just so many people. And the consistent thing in their lives, it seemed to be like, was the gospel. So I thought, hey, maybe there is something to this plan of happiness. Like maybe that is a way to have more happiness and joy in your life. Maybe I should try that out, right? So I remember calling my parents and kind of like the prodigal son, like begging my dad to give me a chance to move back home to St. George and reset my life. And my parents are just, they're just such incredible people. And they gave me a shot and said, all right, you can come back and live in our house, but there's strict rules and you need to be working full time or going to college, both, and got to go to church. And I'm like, all right, I'm so desperate. I'm so down and out, and let's do this. So I moved back home, and so many miracles happen when I know you talk about this too, actually, a lot in your episodes and with people that once you decide and you just exhibit a little bit of faith, like miracles happen, right? And you still face a lot of challenges. And I did. I had to live a lot of serious consequences. And I feel like I still do to this day for some of the choices I made. But I moved back home, and I actually had one of my brothers and some other family members that had gone through similar challenges, and they were trying to get back on the right path. And so there were four of us that all moved into my parents' house. We all started going to single ward together, and I started going to Dixie College. I got a job at Fabulous Freddy's. Did you? I think you worked there too, didn't you? At one point,
Yep, I worked.
you were on River Road though, right? Not Bluff.
Yep, I was on River Road, and I also was there with your brother Brandon and my brother Paul. So,
So at this time, I'm like, okay, I got to surround myself with good people. And Paul, at this time, was recently off his mission, and I knew him. We were friends before his mission. He's my older brother's age, but we all hung out together. And I remember, and I actually talked with my dad not too long ago about this, and he was saying how he remembers Paul right after his mission. He's like, I don't think I've seen anyone that had like the light of Christ in their lives more than Paul. Like that dude just like shone. He had this like amazing spirit about him. If you know Paul, he's just everybody loves him. He's like just he's like this chiseled man, but he's so like loving and kind and just the sweetest person. I love Paul. Shout out to Paul.
he really quick, I want to just put a plug in for, I usually like don't like to interrupt and I just like to let the guest talk, but gotta give Paul a shout out because he also, when I was going through all of my crap, he was a beacon of light in my life. He would just say, Ash, like, you need to go talk to the bishop. He was just this beacon for me that I wanted to be like my brother. I looked up to him so much in every way, and he's actually like guided my life in so many different ways from my career spiritually. And anyway, shout out to Paul. He is the best.
Yep. I saw him not too long ago. We're in St. George. I love that man. So shout out to Paul. Kevin, his one of his good friends, Kevin Hill. Shout out to Kevin. I remember we road trip to California at this time, and we were all active in the church. We were college kids. Like you want to just be listening to music, and we're all into like electro music at the time. And we were actually going to a music festival down there. But Kevin like made us listen to conference talks and like lectures on the prophet Joseph Smith. It was like awesome. So it's cool to see these like, four guys in their 20s that are listening to this stuff. And it just built me up, right? And peace started entering my life, right? It's amazing how a lot of these self-inflicted challenges started to go away. And there's still so many challenges, right? And like that's a consistent theme in my life. Like you hit on later on that like being engulfed in the gospel and living it doesn't take challenges away, but it helps you get through them, right? Like I don't know how I could have handled so many challenges in my life, even 10 years past this time without Jesus Christ, right? And so going back to this kind of phase of my life, there was a number of things that had happened. And I know I feel bad for people. I hear it still to this day that people that had bad experiences with bishops, when they try to come back or confessing something in their youth or even older. And like, personally, I haven't had that experience. Like I went back to the singles ward. I had to open up about a lot of crap I had done. And shout out to Bishop Adams and Bishop Paul. I always had loving understanding. I never felt judged, just felt like they were just grateful for me to be back. And so that was an awesome experience. talking about living the consequences of your actions, right? Like I'm doing all the right stuff. I'm going to school, working, like active in the church. I got a calling, like start taking the sacrament again. But I still had this pending, this second DUI, and like the court case took some time, and it was up in Utah County, and I'm living in St. George. So, and couldn't even drive. Like my driver's license had been taken away for 2 years. So I remember like having to ask my mom for a ride up to court, right? So I finally get convicted, and this is crazy. Like a huge part of my conversion story is an experience in jail. It's kind of unique. And I had to serve the mandatory minimum on a second DUI in Utah was 10 days in jail. And it had to be consecutive. So you couldn't just go do weekends, right? And so, I'm in challenge with being in school and working. And so I asked the court if they could extend I had to go do it within 6 months. And I said, hey, can we extend this so I can do it over Christmas break? Because I'm in school full time and have a job. And they let me do that. So I did not want to be in jail on Christmas Day. Right? Like, just how terrible does that sound? So I remember I had to get one of my professors to allow me to take final early so that I could go to jail and get out on Christmas Eve. I'd worked it all out so I could get out on Christmas Eve. And at the same time, I was going through and reading the Book of Mormon cover to cover myself and kind of taking on the Book of Mormon challenge on my own. Like I had read it as a family. My dad was like, he'd wake us up at the crack of dawn and we'd read scriptures. So I had read through it and through, seminary and throughout my life, but I'd never read it like cover to cover on my own. So thought that was a good idea. So I read it and I finished it right before I had to go to jail. And so I did, I prayed very sincerely to know if it was true. And I asked my mom for Christmas and my parents because I felt bad that like I had, put them through all this stuff and they didn't know me anything. But I just said, hey, for Christmas this year, can you give me a ride to and from jail? And I wanted a Paul Millsap jersey, a big Jazz fan growing up in Utah. And so I was like, those are just the two things. That's all I asked for Christmas. So my mom picks me up at Dixie College, drives me up, drops me off at the Utah County Jail. And there was a number of things that happened. And the first thing that happened was I get an intake. And if you haven't been in county jail, intake, you're like thrown in a room, 5 bunk beds, most uncomfortable beds. They're metal, it's cold, so uncomfortable. And you've got the randomest people in there, like severity of criminals from nothing to major criminals. And you get classified, then you get put in population. So it's just like not a fun place to be. There's like one toilet just sitting out in the open right there. So I get in there, and before I could go back to population, and you're in there, and there's like nothing. When you get in population jail, there's like books, and you can get released, and like you can read books, play games. So you're sitting in there, and I was in intake, and I'm like, look under the bunk bed I was in, and there is a Book of Mormon. I kid you not. So I was like, wow, there's a sign. And I was able to read that for a day before I like went back to the area of the jail that I was going to be in for the remaining 9 days or 8 days, whatever it was. So and I remember praying that I would get a cellmate. Because when you go back, the rooms I were going into had this tiny little room. Like you could reach out and touch both walls. You had one cellmate. And I was just so nervous that I was going to get somebody that, who knows what. It was just, I wanted somebody where I felt comfortable. And I prayed very, very hard for that. And I get back there and I had the sweetest Armenian man. He's from Armenia and he had been in there for months, just, you could tell he was a good person. And was a truck driver and had gotten pulled over and was on an immigration hold. Like he was no criminal, hadn't done anything serious. It was just some immigration thing and he was stuck in the system. He was my cellmate and he was just the sweetest guy. So I felt comfortable there, right? 2 days before I was supposed to be released. So I've been in there 8 days and they told me like, you're going to serve 10 days. There's no good time when you're in there for that little amount of time. And so I'm expecting 2 more days and they called me up one day and I like, Derek, you're getting released. And I was so confused. I'm like, I got 2 more days. What the heck? And I remember walking out and two of my brothers, my two brothers, and we have two, Brandon and Trevor were there to pick me up. I still don't know. It was just a tender mercy. I don't know why I was released, if I got good time, if the jail was at capacity. But those three things combined after I had prayed intently to know if the Book of Mormon was true, was just such a powerful sign to me that God knew who I was, that he loved me, and he was testifying that it was true. So, I always have to remind myself of those experiences. I don't know how, I probably haven't told very many people that full story, but it was just such a clear cut answer to me. And I think you could look at any little one of those things and just say, oh, that was just a coincidence, like, wow, there's a Book of Mormon in there. Like it's a Utah County jail. There's probably a bunch of them laying around, or, you just got lucky with this one guy. But like it, to me, when I feel like when you're looking for those signs, they're there. And sometimes it's the Holy Ghost whispering to you that like, hey, this is the right path. This is true. I know you. I love you. So that all happened. From then, I've never been able to deny it. I know you've said the same thing. Like I would be lying if I denied the experiences I've had that have testified of the truthfulness of the church, right? And the Book of Mormon. If the Book of Mormon's true, the church is true in my mind, right? Not a lot of the little things don't matter. There's still a lot to the story, right? I moved back home, and a couple really powerful experiences too that reinforced my testimony. Getting my patriarchal blessing, that's something I never did when in my youth. So I did this at, I don't know, 22 or 23 years old when I was living in St. George. And that was something where the spirit just was so strong. And I read that regularly. I'll forget about it, and then I'll be going through a tough time. In fact, the last year I've had some personal challenges, and I've read that many, many times, and it just touches me. It's personal scripture. So that has been just such a blessing to me. There was a really cool experience where the stake president of the singles boards at Dixie College, that stake was, it was President Myers. He's a doctor in St. George. My dad's a doctor, so we actually knew him. I was friends with his son, Preston, who you probably knew, and he had a lot of challenges. So he was the stake president. He came over with an Area 70. Actually, it was Brother Wilkinson. If you remember Tyler Wilkinson from St. George, they made a Mormon movie about him where he was in a car accident when he was or he was a big high school football player at Dixie, and it's a really cool story. I mean, it's tragic, but he turned it into such a positive thing. But he was in a tragic car accident and was paralyzed. And the church made it. I don't know if the church made it or who made it, but I remember watching it in the 90s. It came out in like the early 90s, but this is his dad. And he came to visit me and the three others that were living at my parents' house at the time. And I'll never forget that experience. He just spent a lot of time with us. He knew that we had all had a lot of challenges and we're kind of on our journey back. And he made a strong challenge to all four of us to read the scriptures for 15 minutes a day. And if we did that, our lives would be blessed. And I stuck to that challenge. I don't know now, 12 years later or 14 years, however long it's been, if I've like stuck to it every single day, but I've tried, or I'll at least listen to a conference talk or something. But it blessed my life. It's amazing. And two of us did keep that challenge and two of us didn't. And what I can say is like the outcomes of our lives to this point have been very different. So that's been a strong testimony. And think about that. You're in the world 24 hours a day. Can we just give God 15 minutes? It's not much time, but otherwise it's just so hard. Like Satan is coming after us so hard. It's not easy to stay strong and avoid temptation. So that was a really cool experience. But also there were so many challenges because I think, these stories, it's not like you have this amazing like Alma the Younger conversion story and then life is great forever. And like this was reinforced to me even back then. I was still going to Dixie College. My license was taken away. There's not a lot of good public transportation in St. George, Utah. I had a night class and my parents were out of town. I was living at their house and I had sold the car I had. I had some beat up old car, but I'd sold it. I didn't want to be tempted to drive and I did not want to get a ticket, like driving on a suspended license. So I'd been clean for over a year at this time and was doing all the right things you're supposed to be doing, but I did not have a ride to go to this class. And so I'm like, okay, my parents have a little scooter. I'll just drive that down to Dixie, go to class, come home, and it'll be fine. You can't even speed on that thing. Like it goes like 35 miles an hour max. So I go to class and it's done. I'm driving back off the campus. They were doing all this construction. They were building that new Jeffrey R. Holland building at the time. And I went around some construction zone, some cone, and a campus cop pulls me over. And I just remember sitting there thinking, no, oh my gosh, like this can't be happening. Like, please just have him like give me some warning and let me go. Praying in my heart, God, I'm doing all the right stuff. Like just this can't be happening. And the guy, he was not nice. He was one of those campus cops that had a lot of ego. So I was so humble. I'm like, sir, I'm so sorry. Like, why did you, first off, why'd you pull me over? And he's like, well, you can't go around. Like, you drove through this construction zone. Cause I'm like, I was so confused when he pulled me over. So I was like, I'm so sorry. Like, I had no idea. I'm just going home from class. And he goes, well, let me see your license and registration, all this stuff. And I'm like, I just came over to a night class I have. I don't have any of it on me. So he's like, well, give me your name, date of birth, like writes it all down, goes back in his car. And at that point, I'm like, this is not ending well. He comes back out and he says, hey, your license is suspended. Like, I'm writing you a ticket for that. I was like, sir, I'm so sorry. I know that I have not been driving. This was a one-time thing. Is there any way you can give me a warning? And he's like, you should just be grateful I'm not impounding your scooter and taking you to jail.
Oh
I
my
was like,
God.
yep. So, and then he drives over to this like parking lot and parks facing me to just make sure that I don't like drive off. And if I would, he would have arrested me. So that was a big challenge where I had to really, because I think some people get in this mindset that like if you're doing all the right things, everything's going to be fine and dandy. And somebody picked me up, took me home. What happened? I had my driver's license suspended for 2 years at the time. Because of that, I got a letter from the DMV. They added an entire year, and
Oh,
so I'm like a year into a 2 years of no license, and I'm 22 years old. Not a fun time to not be able to drive. And so it was just like devastating. But I think, all in God's timing, it turns out the timing worked out. It's probably, a huge reason why I'm married to my wife today was the timing of when I got my license back. And so looking back, all of these things are God's plan. But at the time, it's like, why? Why would this happen to me when I'm doing all the right things? So that was another, good experience for me to go through. I guess just kind of cut to a couple of things. And if you have questions, go shoot them away. But I ended up transferring up to the University of Utah. I moved up there with my brother, Brandon, who, hopefully he'll come on the podcast. And he was such a good influence. He had been through a lot of the same challenges and like, he's just a stud. He's got an incredible family, an incredible life now. And so we moved up there together. And it was actually like, felt like I turned 16 again because I moved to Salt Lake, lived right by a track station and go up to the campus, like hop on a train. Like didn't even matter not having a driver's license. And Paul ended up moving in with us. And like, it was just such a fun experience and just a great time of life. Paul ends up getting married and moving out, and he actually lived pretty close. So we still were able to hang out quite a bit. But just one of the things, just kind of thinking about God's timing was it was hard to date like seriously when you don't have a driver's license at this age.
I can relate to that.
Yep. So I would, date girls, nothing serious. And I was at a point in my life where I'm like, I was kind of craving that, getting into a serious relationship and progressing and maybe getting married. And I just got my driver's license back and I hadn't had it for 3 years. And a bunch of us friends were going to Lake Powell. And because I had my license back, like nobody wanted to drive from Salt Lake to Lake Powell, but I'm like, I'll drive. Like I was just so happy and eager to drive. Like I don't care. I'll drive for the night. I'll drive for 20 hours straight. Like this is awesome. So we drive down there and my now wife, who I'd never met before, she was with another group of friends staying on a different houseboat, but I happen to know the people that own this houseboat and a lot of these people that were there. And we go over and we're just like saying hi to this crew and I meet my now wife and we were kind of flirting and talking. But then she heard all these people that were like, oh, Derek just got his license back. So I find out later that she went to somebody after like we first met this one night. And the next day when I see her, she was kind of giving me a cold shoulder and she was kind of throwing off vibes like maybe there's something there the first night. So I'm like, what the heck changed? Turns out she like went and asked somebody, hey, why did Derek not have his driver's license? And they're like, oh, he had DUIs and he didn't have it for years. So she was like, okay, I can't date someone like that. And she's the most amazing person in the world. She's not just like a judge someone by that, but she had an experience dating somebody with a similar past. And she was just like, that's not something I'm going to put up with and deal with, which is totally fine. But turns out another person, Taylor Brody, shout out to Taylor Brody. I don't know if you ever met him, but he went to her and said, hey, Derek is actually a really good person. This was like over 3 years ago. He's changed. Like, give him a chance. And like looking back, if I wouldn't have got my driver's license at that time. Like none of these events would have happened. And like the biggest blessing in my life is my wife. And we have four kids. And I'm talking about four daughters, you know that, but and that is everything. And I would have never dreamed when I was going through the challenges I went through and sitting in jail that I would ever have a family. You know, you just sit there and beat yourself up like I can't have a career. I can't. No one's going to want to marry me. I can't have. And I have this amazing life, and it's because of Christ, and I'm so blessed. But it's just funny how like you look back and those things happen for a reason, and here we are 10 years later. We've been married 10 years. We have four kids. And I just baptized my oldest, Goldie. She's 8. She's so incredible. I baptized her just this year, and it was like the most incredible experience and so touching and humbling to me. And well, another thing I'll say that happened though, after my wife and I were dating, I graduated from the U. She had a job and was living in Salt Lake, and I moved to Southern California for work. And it was kind of this like, we're dating long distance. Things felt right, but I was still like so unsure of, do I marry this person? What's the right thing? And I had never been serious with somebody like this. So I was just kind of in this tough spot. At this point, I'd been back involved in the church and active for years, but I had not gone back to the temple. And I just remember feeling like I needed to go to the temple. And I had never received my endowment. So I was like, I'm going to go, meet with the bishop out here. I was living in Huntington Beach and like get ready, go do baptism. Just felt like that was the right thing to do. And I go through that process, and I'll never forget going to the temple in Newport Beach, just the spirit I felt going back into a temple, and just answers I received and personal revelation that like it was right to, go forward, get engaged. Like you'd be an idiot not to marry this woman. And I found this like in my life, a lot of times I like have to take this leap of faith and like move forward, and God kind of will give me signs if I'm on the wrong path. But just to kind of reiterate the value of the temple. And I remember when we got married in the temple, the sealer reiterated like the biggest takeaway. He said it was like, come back to the temple often, and it's obviously a big theme by President Nelson and our church leaders. And it's hard when you have a young family, but I'm trying to make that more of a priority. And every time I go, the spirit is so strong, and it reinforces so many things that I know that are true. Cause again, it's like, it's so hard in this world when Satan has a lot of influence. And as you know, so many people are leaving the church and over little things. And it's like, man, do those little things really matter? Like go back to the basics, and Dusty Smith, who was on your podcast maybe over a year ago, was one of the first ones I listened to.
Yeah,
Dusty's the lawyer. He was a convert, then fell away and went like strong anti for years. He actually just did a fireside this last Sunday for our stake.
that is
And I just like, I know this guy. I listened to him on the podcast. So they broadcast and I watched it. And like, he talks about that. Like he's a lawyer. He's delved into the most anti stuff ever, but just go back to the basics. And he had so many miracles that happened in his story. And it's like people say to me, like, you had all these miracles. Like, I don't have those miracles in my life. And he said, if you look at your life and look for them, they're there. Those little things, like I go back to my conversion story and sitting in jail, like all these small little things that were massive miracles to me, finding that Book of Mormon in intake, having an amazing cellmate who was just, the most loving guy, such a blessing, getting out a few days early, and all these little things that happen. And you look back, those are miracles, right? And like when you have the Spirit in your life and you're looking for them, you can acknowledge those, and it reinforces what's true. So that's something I always have to remind myself. But I remember too, when we got married, we were still in the temple, and I just remember thinking like, all I have to do is endure to the end now. Like life's easy. Like I've made like the most, highest level of covenants. Like it's just literally enduring to the end. Like, but man, is that hard, right? Like in 10 years of marriage, there's ups and downs in professional life and raising kids. Like there's so much stress. And if I didn't have the gospel, I don't know how I would endure some of these parts of my life. Challenges will come up, and you always have to fall back on those little things. And I feel like if I start to slip away from, reinforcing my testimony, reflecting on things that have happened in my past, reading my scriptures, praying, going to the temple as much as you can, read your patriarchal blessing. I can't deny the spirit that I felt keeps things in perspective, right? Like there's a quote from, this was a quote I heard recently that was reinforced to me and I love it. It's from President Nelson. The joy in our lives has little to do with the circumstances of our lives, but everything to do with the focus of our lives. I find that when my focus gets away from Christ and I focus on like, I want more money or need this in my career, right? Whatever it might be, that's when Satan comes in and you're weak and susceptible to his deception. But like, do those little things and you'll know truth and you can stay strong. So, but yeah, that's my story, Ashley.
Such good advice. It's crazy how many parallels we have in both of our stories, from losing our license to mine was a Book of Mormon bookmark that I found that was my
Yeah.
miracle. Yours was a Book of Mormon in a jail cell, and
Yeah.
it's crazy. There's so many parallels, and I can relate so much. But with you having these beautiful girls, what do you think that you will do to try to safeguard them from going down the same path that you went down?
That is an excellent question. And it worries me. Now being a parent, I can't fathom what I put my parents through. And they're just such incredible people. One thing, and I feel like this is kind of a challenge in the church and in a lot of the culture of people think everyone's perfect. At least I felt this way. I thought my leaders, my parents, like they couldn't relate to me. They never tried. They never partied. They didn't do this. Like they don't understand. And a lot of them have. And I've learned later in life that so many people I looked up to had so many challenges or they didn't go on a mission or, all these people look at me. One of the reasons why I felt like I should go on this podcast is anytime I share even just a little bit about my story, whether it's in, elders quorum, I teach sometimes there. If I bear my testimony, I have people that come up and they're so grateful. They always say how grateful they are because, they had a similar, like they had a wayward past or they have a child who's going through this. And so they love to see that because they look at me and my family. Not saying I look perfect at all, but my kids they're beautiful. I have four beautiful daughters. My wife, like she dresses them up all cute. So I think people look at our family and think, wow, there is a perfect family and we have our challenges. And what I've been through, I have sat in jail, been the lowest of lows, a drug addict. And so I think we need to do a better job of sharing how people in the church aren't perfect. That's why we need Christ. So I want to open up to my children a little more at the appropriate times of like, not just don't do drugs because it's the word of wisdom and don't drink because the Doctrine and Covenants tells you not to. It's like, don't do it because, hey, I experienced it. I thought that could bring happiness in my life and all it brought was misery. And I also think too that like, I've heard this problem. A lot of people have left the church or aren't part of the church. They're like, that's so stupid. Why does the church say you can't drink? Like having a drink isn't bad. And it's not, right? And like, I know a lot of people in my life that drink and I tell my children that drinking, those people that drink, they're not bad, right? But it is pretty wise because all of the potential downside of drinking alcohol is not worth any upside of having a drink at night, right? That's the way I look at it. And I've seen it to the extreme degree of what addiction and alcohol and drugs can do. But everybody I can interact with throughout my life and my career that drinks, all of them know somebody that's had an issue, or they themselves have. And so it's like, wow, why not just avoid that altogether and avoid the pitfalls? And so I have something that it's a word of wisdom. It is pretty wise to just don't mess with that. But just teaching my kids that, but being more open of like, you can come to me with anything. I've been through this. I think I'm going to know the signs if my kids have some of the challenges I had because I've been through it. They probably won't be able to hide some stuff from me, but I just want to be open and let them know, like, you can come to me with anything. God loves you no matter what. I love you no matter what. There's another quote. I love listening to talks. Elder Holland, he has that quote that says, no one can sink lower than the light of Christ shines. And it's so true. And I just want my children to know that and feel loved and feel like they can come to me with anything.
To me, I feel like the word of wisdom, I'm sure there's other religions out there that probably suggest not to drink alcohol. But to me, seeing what I've seen with the people in my life that do drink alcohol, I mean, obviously, what you said, there is some people that can drink and have just a glass of wine or whatever, and it's not a problem. But of the sample size that I have in my life of the people that I know that have drank, there is a very big percentage of this sample that has problems with alcoholism or drug addiction. And it's like,
Mhm.
that is evidence enough that you're playing with fire. And it's such a testimony builder to me that our church says not to drink alcohol. Like, how inspired is that? Because truly, alcohol has the ability to completely destroy your life. And so, why even go there? So,
I think you've talked about this before too, but I remember thinking when I was young and I was doing this stuff that like, wow, these commandments and the word of wisdom, it's so restrictive. Like, I want my freedom. Let me choose to do all this stuff. But the most freeing thing you can do is live the commandments and live the
yes,
gospel, right? Like, you cannot have more freedoms taken away than sitting in jail, where like you literally
yes,
can't walk out of these bars. And if you get out to the open area, this happened to me in like 8 days in jail. It happened to me 3 times. A correction officer gets mad at somebody and it's 24 hours in your cells. You know, like you have zero freedom. And that's because of choices I was making that I thought were giving me freedom.
yep,
Right. So I've always reflected on that. And God
yes,
knows what's right. Right.
yes.
He,
He does. I was literally just talking to my babysitter about this. She was telling me about somebody that she knew that had gotten a DUI, and I was thinking, how bad did that suck when you had no license? You feel like, especially in
oh,
St. George, you feel like you're trapped. You want to like have a job and you want to do this and you want to do that, but you feel trapped. You can't go anywhere. In addition to that, if you're drinking and driving, you go to jail, like what you just said, and you're experiencing true restriction. But then, even worse, to take it even a step further, alcoholism and drug addiction is actually the worst kind of restriction that you can experience. To be free of that and to experience life without those restrictions by living the gospel it's such a gift.
when I go through these challenges and a lot of it comes down to just the stress, as a father raising 4 kids, career, financial things, like things that obviously are important, but they're not everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I'm going through those, I remember like when I was such an addict and had these no freedoms, no money, like your life was literally trying to get your next fix, craving these types of problems that I have, like normal people problems. I think you've said that same thing. And it's like, okay, I can handle this. This is so much easier than those. It's the most restrictive. You're in a prison, like you're in a prison in your own body, and it's terrible. And I feel so bad for people that are there. And I've told people this, a lot of people that hear my story and they're like, wow, you used heroin. Like what programs did you go through? And I'm not recommending this to people that have true addictions, but the gospel was my recovery. It really was. And I've told it to people in my inner circle that have these issues. And I'm not saying like just do that. Oh, read your scriptures, you're fine. Like seek professional help. Go to, AA, NA. Like there's all these amazing programs. But for me, I kind of didn't do that stuff. I went back to church. I engulfed myself in the gospel. And there's a quote by Elder Packer. He says essentially, studying the gospel will change behavior faster than a study of behavior can change behavior. I'm living proof of that. And again, not saying like, hey, everybody do that, but that was my recovery, right? And God can change you. And that's the whole message I need to get across. Like, I'm a changed person because of God and Jesus Christ and the gospel. And
Yep.
I'm so grateful. I'm so
I
grateful.
I'm right there with you. Like I did go to rehab and I went a lot, like a lot. And I just saw I'm a hopeless cause. Like nothing's working for me, and going back to the church, it completely transformed my whole life. And I mean, just like what you said, everybody, like things work for different people, but President Nilsson said, if you read the Book of Mormon every single day, you will be immunized against the evils of the day, including pornography and other mind numbing addictions. And
Yeah.
that is so powerful.
Well, that was my experience with Elder Wilkinson. He challenged us
Right.
to read the Book of Mormon for 15 minutes a day. And another thing too, this theme has been coming up with me recently in the temple, and all these things they give you power, right? And I remember doing a temple prep class before I went to receive my endowment, and they hammered that point home of like the temple gives you power. The power you get from covenants you make in the temple, the power you get from reading the scriptures, all of that is power to face life and overcome the adversary because he wants us to be miserable. He really does, right? Like he's miserable. So he's coming after us from every angle, every day, all day, every day. And so like you got to do those things to give you the power to overcome those temptations and overcome Satan. Really, is what it is.
Yeah.
So
One last question for you.
yeah.
How in this world today where we have social media and we're always like seeing just all the cool things that everybody's doing, all the cool things they're doing, they look awesome, they're making all the money, they're doing all the things in a world where that's so loud and leaving the church is becoming more and more loud on social media. What do you do to not be distracted by the great and spacious building? We'll put it that way.
I don't spend a lot of time on social media, to be honest. Like I've never really ever spent time on Facebook. I do have an account that I actually had to create at one point for work. Like I never had a Facebook account even when it was big. I do have Instagram and I get in there more than I should, but I still just, so avoid that. Like it's just worthless, in a lot of ways. There's positive, there's opposition in all things, right? There's good and there's bad because of it. But I'm so glad you're doing this podcast and there's others that are putting positive stuff out there because a lot of the negativity is louder than the positivity. And so you don't hear it, right? I try to avoid all that stuff, but it comes back to it's the primary answers, but it's so true. Like, and President Nelson talks about thinking celestial and to do that and to keep that eternal celestial perspective, like you've got to exercise those spiritual muscles. Like even if you're just going to church, if you go for 2 hours a week, that's 2 hours. How many hours are in a week? Hundreds of hours, right? Like think of it, if you want to be healthy, physically and you eat crap 95% of the time and eat healthy a little bit, like you're not going to be healthy. If you want to be strong and you exercise, if you don't hardly ever exercise at all, it's like the same with your spirit, right? And so like, and more things than just reading your scriptures, going to church. The thing that's been huge for me, my patriarchal blessing, again, has been like this awesome guide. And I try to lean on those things when I'm going through hardships rather than, because when you're going through hardships, that's when you're like, Satan knows you're weak. There are many times where I've never thought, man, I want to leave the church, but someone's like, what's the point of this? Like, it's so much, can be a lot of effort. It can feel sometimes like can't be worth it. But then little things happen. And I remind myself of the times where God has made it abundantly clear that he's aware of me, that he loves me, that this is his true church. And when I focus on those things, when I'm going through hard times, it makes them easier. It doesn't make things easy. President Nelson's talk about overcoming the world and finding rest is a great one. If you haven't listened to that, it was a few years ago. So yeah, going to those sources rather than going to social media and doom scrolling and looking at all this negativity, like open up your scriptures, go read your patriarchal blessing, try to go to the temple. Like those places I find peace and it just reminds me of what truly matters. Like this life's going to end and what can you take with you, right? Like your money? No. Your status? No. And that's another beautiful thing in the gospel. Like when you go back to the basics, think about these other religions. Like my family is everything. My wife and my daughters are everything. And even like, my parents and siblings, and I can't fathom life without them. And like, we are an eternal family. Can you imagine being married till death do you part? Like just that alone. What a blessing. I think going back to that same quote, like it's the focus of your lives, not the circumstances of your lives. And social media, it's hard. And, you see what I've learned too is most people make their life seem better than they are. They're not doing as good in all these areas that they make it seem like they're doing great. And comparison is the thief of joy. And I struggle with that regularly. And I have to just remind myself, I am so blessed. There's always people that are doing better than me, but then I think about how many more people are probably doing worse than me and would kill for the life that I have. And then I can always fall back to, again, I have been at the lowest of lows, going through the, drug addiction and it's like, okay, hey, I went through that. I can go through anything and like, I can do hard things and remember where I've been.
That was awesome. Well, Derek, it's been so awesome having you on the podcast. Just, I love your story and it's so inspiring. And you You're just a legend, you know?
Oh, I'm grateful. I just hope this touches somebody, like it was scary putting my story out there, but hey, if I can help one person, it's worth it. And I love what you're doing. Your podcast has helped me put positivity in your life. Sometimes I'll just I'll go mountain biking. And I live in Salt Lake area and I just got into mountain biking. I'll go do a ride and I'll listen to a comeback story. And it's so awesome and touching, right? And so I love what you're doing. I'm glad we're able to do this and
Me too.
hopefully it does some good out there.
It will. I
We'll
know
get
that.
Brandon. We'll see if we can get Brandon on.
Yes, Brandon. Shout out to Brandon. You're next.
Okay. Challenges out there.
A lot of people have asked us how they can support the podcast, and we have created a Comeback Podcast merch line on our website, www.comebackpodcast.org. All of the money made from the merch goes right back into the podcast. So if you are interested in supporting the podcast and you want to purchase some merch, we would love it. Check it out. Thank you so much for being a supporter of the Comeback Podcast and listening to our episodes. It would mean so much to us if you would like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps other people be able to find us, and we want to share this message to everyone.